I now come to our next speaker, who is Professor Jean-Marc Jancovici, who has various hats. He is actually involved in I think you can explain better than I can, a research organization called Carbone 4, and is an expert on issues related to the management of carbon. He also is at the École Nationale Supérieure des Mines de Paris, and a member of the French delegation, as I understand it, at 3 of the conferences of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. He will use his expertise in climate, in energy, and in economic growth to assess the risks of collapse and the prospects for a low-carbon economy, which is one of the ways we hope to be able to avert collapse. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I went back to school for this little address because I tried to answer the question. So the short answer to the question is no. We are not going to avert systemic collapse if we understand systemic collapse in the way of a collapse of the global population and the global productive system. And I think that here in the OECD, apart from the economic system, the rest is a little bit secondary. So we are not going to avert systemic collapse. That's what I'm going to conclude, because of the very way we have thought our economic system. So I'm also going to discuss about the Earth. This is planet Earth. It's square, and actually it has 2 compartments, because I take it from humanity's point of view. So from humanity's point of view, what is planet Earth? It's a bunch of resources. Okay, it's just a basket of resources. It's our space vessel. Those resources, I put them in 2 drawers, and 2 only. Those that naturally renew if we don't draw from these resources too quickly, and those that never renew even if we don't draw too quickly. For example, in the second category, you have metal ores. The day you have extracted iron ores or copper ores from the Earth crust, they're gone. I mean, they're not in the crust anymore. In the first category, you have typically, I don't know, grass, wind, whatever, things that renew if we don't use it too fast. Then one thing which is absolutely major for me is that this is the result of 40 billion, give or take half a billion years, not much on this time scale, since the Big Bang. And that evolution has created for us a planet for free, an ocean for free, an atmospheric system for free, 30 million species, more or less, for free, ores for free, fossil fuels for free. I remember that it takes 50 to 400 million years to form fossil fuels, etc. So all this is free. No one in this room paid a single cent for oil to form, or for iron ore to form, or for copper ore to form, or for the genetic code, of trees to form. All this has been granted to us for free. Now comes humanity. And humanity is going to do something very simple called production. And production is actually, in terms of physical flows, very simple. We extract resources from the environment and transform them. All that you see in this room, all that you will see in your life from birth to death, are natural resources, either as they are or transformed by man's work. At the very beginning, we are not very numerous, not very productive, so the amount of natural resources that we draw from renewable stocks do not hinder the capacity of the stocks to renew themselves. Okay? The first fishermen do not deplete the stocks of fish. So the stocks remain even. But the first day we pick stones from the stock of stones decreases a little. At the time, it's not really an issue, so we can go on. And one day, we discover energy. What is energy from an engineer's point of view or a physicist's point of view? It's actually using a converter. Using energy is using a converter. You don't drink oil and you don't eat coal, and I don't advise that you put your fingers into the socket. So actually using energy is not using it for yourself, except when you eat or bath in the sun. But using energy is actually using machines. And what you should keep in mind is that using more and more energy is just using more and more machines, which explains why we have become more and more productive. because otherwise we're not like Shiva. We're not 100 times more productive because we have 100 pairs of arms and 100 pairs of legs. I don't think evolution allowed that. So what we do when we use energy is that we add to our bodies an exoskeleton which is a couple hundred times more powerful. At the time we are speaking right now, the installed power of all machines on Earth, from boats to elevators and vacuum cleaners to stoves, is a couple hundred times the muscular power of humanity. So those that produce are machines, not us. We don't do anything. We command machines, but otherwise we don't produce. The productive capacity of the world is machines. So people discover energy, and so they're able to produce more per person and extract faster resources from the environment. They're also able to invent capital, which is the way to spare part of the past production to increase the future production. That's basically what it is, capital. Please note that when using more and more energy, one of the things that you're able to extract faster from the environment is food. The productivity of agriculture in France has been increased by 7 to 8 between 1945 and 1975, thanks to fossil fuels, namely tractors, fertilizers, and pesticides. Okay. So extracting more and more food, we can become more and more numerous with more and more machines, so we extract more and more things from the environment, transform more and more. And one day, we are so numerous and so productive that not only the stocks that do not renew deplete, but the stocks that could renew start to deplete also. Today, for example, the stock of commercial fish in the Northern Atlantic is, depending on the sources, 5 to 10 times lower of what it was a century ago. You all know the story of the cod in Canada that has fully vanished. So a number of stocks disappear, forests in the world disappear, etc., etc. And in the course of that productive activity, we also create a number of unwanted byproducts that we call pollution. So pollution basically is all the unwanted byproducts of our activity that we create without the ability to avoid it. Like, for example, when you burn fossil fuels, you create a byproduct which is CO2, carbon dioxide, and you just cannot avoid that. Okay? And that pollution is all these unwanted products that go into the environment and decrease the quality or the quantity of the remaining resources. That's what they do, namely. And they can decrease the quality of these resources instantly or with a lag. And typically for CO2, you have a lag, because I don't know how many people in the room do know the residence time of a CO2 surplus once into the air, but I'm going to recall that because it's pretty important in our discussion. The day we stop emissions, okay? 1 century after, a little half of the CO2 surplus will still be hovering over our heads. 1,000 years after, 20% of that CO2 surplus will still be into the air. 10,000 years after, okay, a blink of an eye, the 10% of that CO2 surplus will still be above our head, which means that there is no such thing as a reset button regarding climate change. There is absolutely no possibility to put things back in place. No possibility. And because of that inertia of the CO2 into the air, the only thing that we can deduct the day consequences of climate change are unbearable is that they are going to be worse later on. That's the only certainty we have because of the inertia of CO2 into the air. So pollution, again, is immediate effects or delayed effects of unwanted substances into the environment. And what we have designed when we look at the economic system is a flow unit, which is the GDP. As you know, the GDP is the counterpart of the production of the year. That is economic figures that we put on the physical flow that we create each year, extracting things from the environment and converting them into other things. And we do that even in services. For example, education cannot take place without a building, without people commuting to the place where there is education, or without networks to do remote teaching. But networks, as it was said by the Secretary General, are even worse than going to, to high school. And actually, the report that said that today the global digital system emitted 4% of the world emission comes from us. And it's growing by 10% per year. So you have nothing more unsustainable than the digital economy, nothing. So what we have created is here an indicator which is measuring a flow, which we have called the GDP. Of course, you can understand from this very simple diagram that there is no such thing as perpetual growth when production peaks into stocks that cannot renew or that cannot renew as fast as we are using them. And when the stock is going to run, when we're going to run out of stock, of course, the flow is going to collapse. Obvious. We should have designed an accounting where we would have counted with a positive figure what we have created, but with a negative figure what we have destroyed. And the day the marginal value of the last car is lower than the marginal value of the iron ore and the coal and the oil, etc., that we have used to manufacture the car, we stop manufacturing cars and live happily ever after with the cars that we already have. Sorry, my 10 minutes are over. I just want to recall with the... I don't know, how do I stop this?
She doesn't like what you said about energy.
That's it. I just wanted to recall a graph from the Meadows report precisely, or the report to the Club of Rome, or the limits to growth, as you name it. As you know, they thought of a physical economy, actually. That was the great innovation of that model. They designed the economy as a physical system. And that physical system is exactly as I had described it just before. It's a matter of flows, and one of these flows has a counterpart, which is dollars or euros or whatever. At the beginning of the simulation that they have designed, let's say at the beginning of the 20th century, you see that the population is low, the food supply is low, industrial product is low, and the remaining resources are very high. Then at the time of the release of the report, everything was growing regarding the indicators that we do care for, that is population, production, agriculture, etc. And the depletion of resources was not, I would say, dramatic. They never said that the system would collapse in 20 or 30 or 40 years. They never said, as I read everywhere, that oil supply would disappear in 30 or 40 years. They never said that. Actually, what they said is that today, things would still be growing. So in the business as usual scenario, the day we are gathering today, things are still growing. But it's for afterwards that things are going to, that the rough times are going to happen. And namely, the generation of our children, and my generation for the rest of my life, probably, are probably going to witness a significant number of cracks and a growing number of cracks into the system. Okay? So the future generations, they are born today. The future generations, they are born today. They are not for the future. They are born today. It's the kids that you see every day at home. So that's what I wanted to recall, because as it was mentioned before, we are unfortunately still on track on that simulation. And so this is, to my knowledge, the best macroeconomic model that I've ever seen, because it's predictive over 40 years. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jean-Marc, for that very instructive presentation. As a former Secretary General of the Club of Rome, I'm very glad to have your endorsement. This model of overshoot and collapse, or this scenario.
Pushing the mic, and that's why his mic cut, so
turned off.
Please don't touch it.
Thank you. Well, I won't go back to the beginning, only to say that this scenario of overshoot and collapse, as you rightly say, has been reviewed by independent experts to see where we are, and regrettably we're tracking that scenario pretty accurately. But I wouldn't take issue, but I'd just like to follow up on one point you said very boldly. We are not going to avert systemic collapse. That's a pretty serious remark. I think many of us understand that we cannot solve our problems in the simple sense of getting the problems to go away. What we are now in is the business of mitigating the damage and getting the very best outcome that we can. We have to think what we mean by collapse, because we haven't discussed that yet. There are different, in systems analysis, there are different modes of collapse. We have to think what we mean, but in principle, We hope that we don't have to agree with you on that and that we can find ways to produce a decent world, a dignified world, as Albert called it, in spite of the problems we're talking about. But the one point which is clear to everybody is the sooner we start to act, the better the chances will be. We now come to a very different world.